You are listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
And today, guest
Alexandra Prokuda,
also known as Sasha.
Yes.
Sasha, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Today, I wanted to have a quick conversation about the origins of COVID-19 and what that means about science and scientific certainty. And it's a troubling story, and I know that there's a lot of passionate feelings all around, and people want to believe one theory or hypothesis or another, and that's why I want to have this conversation. So I'm going to start by basically saying that we don't know the origin of COVID-19, but we have a lot of thoughts as a society about where it might have come from. And one of the possible origins is that it was man-made, because there is a coronavirus lab in Wuhan, China, and some people, such as Jon Stewart, believe that it was human-generated and then accidentally escaped into the wider world. That is a possibility. Other people believe that COVID-19 was a naturally occurring virus that jumped from wild animals to humans in a meat market or a wet market in Wuhan, China. But it's not man-made. It was simply a naturally occurring virus, and unfortunately escaped into the human, or escaped isn't really the right word, jumped into the human population, and we all know what happened over the past 3 years. The challenge from a scientific perspective is that different authorities seem to point their finger in different places. Some authorities, such as the Department of Energy, recently said with low confidence that they think that it actually was an escaped virus from the Wuhan facility, the research facility, whereas other authorities say, no, we sincerely believe that it was a naturally occurring virus that accidentally and unfortunately jumped into humans. So the question is, who should we believe and when and why? The best answer that I've ever heard, and I can jump to a conclusion, then we're going to talk about it, is from a virologist. And what she said is that we have to believe all of the above, that without conclusive scientific data, we must assume that all of the proposed hypotheses are correct and then act accordingly, which seems quite contradictory if you're not a scientist and don't do this stuff on a regular basis, but in fact is exactly how scientists behave.
That's right. Yeah, you have to assume that your hypothesis could be supported or refuted and be able to create a new hypothesis to test the same idea, but with a different origin story.
And the challenge is that maybe neither of these stories are in fact correct. Mallory, you were telling me earlier about something you saw this morning about...
Yeah, so some research came out where right after the first initial outbreak of COVID, so in January of 2020, the Chinese research, I think it's a government research group, I'm not positive on that, went and swabbed wet meat markets all over the surfaces and analyzed a bunch of the genomic sequences that came from there. And they didn't really have anything conclusive, but they made the data publicly available. And then scientists from other countries started analyzing the publicly available data, and they found in some of the swabs there was both coronavirus and raccoon dog DNA. So,
what's a raccoon dog?
Tanuki.
Can you describe a raccoon dog, Sasha?
It looks like a raccoon dog hybrid. And it's my cat's name.
Oh. Yeah, I heard they have the banding that's very much like a raccoon, but it looks more structurally like a dog than a raccoon.
So if they have DNA samples that show these two in the same place at the same time, why is that not conclusive evidence that that's where it came from?
Just because two pieces of genomic information are in the same area at the same time doesn't mean they came from each other. So think about a crime scene, for example. If, say, a crime occurred in your home, they could go there and get multiple DNA samples from multiple people, including family members that had been there. Just because your DNA is in the home doesn't mean you committed the crime.
So how do we communicate better about this type of a topic? We have people who feel very strongly that, well, this is clear evidence. So that's what happened.
Feelings aren't facts. I think we have to keep recognizing that. Whereas people do feel passionately about things, especially when they have a political or social motivation to think about that. But the scientific viewpoint of going around any of this information is to be open-minded and be willing to be wrong.
So what would have to happen to conclusively conclude the origin of COVID-19, do you think? Either you, Sasha, anybody?
Have you seen the movie Contagion, where at the very end they zoomed back into a meat market and saw the pig being consumed? Do we have some sort of time machine?
That would be super helpful. That's the thing is like, if you talk to any scientist about anything, the answer is always, it depends.
Right.
Right? It's never yes, no. It's not like how we're taught in books where facts are facts and that's that, It's always like, well, yes, but, or, well, if this happened, then maybe. Like, it's because what we do is look at the world and how do things come to be.
Right.
And there are just so many different ways that things can come to be. Like even the smallest, thing, like how did I happen to be in this podcast studio today? You could have a myriad, right? Like hypotheses.
Right.
Maybe I drove here. Maybe I flew on an airplane and took a parachute down. Maybe.
I'm pretty sure that's what happened.
That was you? I was wondering who that was.
I mean, there is an air base.
Yeah. Our campus does have an airport, yes.
So, anything in life has many different explanations potentially. What we do is try to look at the circumstantial evidence around that event to see what actually happened.
Right.
And something like that can even have many more potentialities than me arriving at the studio, right?
Right. I think that's the thing, too, is if you're trying to take a historical perspective and figure out something that happened in the past and not something that is a current process, it's much harder. So if you're studying an animal or a cell or a particle that exists in the present and you're trying to determine what it's doing, you can keep testing that over and over and over and look at it from 1,000 different ways with 1,000 different experiments. But when you're trying to determine how a past event happened, there is a right answer. There is something that happened, but we can't test it in 1,000 different ways. We can just collect all the evidence surrounding it. It's like forensics.
Yep, exactly.
And we have to make our best guess based on that. And currently, there is no best guess. We have a pool of potential culprits, and we cannot file charges against any of them at this point.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. So if we were to go to a court of law and basically say we need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the coronavirus originated in this manner, we are unable to convict anybody at this point.
Because there's a reasonable doubt.
There's a reasonable doubt for every proposed hypothesis at that point, and it may be that the truth is none of them.
Right.
It may be the actual original source of COVID is not in line with any of the stories that have, or hypotheses that have been publicized at this point, which means that it may be unknowable and that we may not ever truly know the origin of COVID-19. And listening to the two of you talk, it was inspiring for me because it was also helping me think a little bit about this nation, why I thought the virologist was so exciting when she said that we have to assume that all of the possibilities are true. Because we need to proceed. We need, as a society, to decide what we're going to do next as a consequence of the COVID-19. So we have to come up with plans as if this type of virus can jump in a wet market, but we also have to make plans in case a laboratory release takes place, and we also have to potentially make plans for another scenario, which we're not even thinking of today.
I think we've been informed on this a lot, too, by Ebola outbreaks, because we never know for sure where that came from. The hypothesis is often a bat is the vector that transmits to humans in the Ebola outbreak. With HIV, the current hypothesis, to my knowledge, is the cut hunter hypothesis, but they still call it a hypothesis, where somebody who was butchering bush meat cut themselves and transferred a simian immunodeficiency virus that just happened to have the right properties to infect human cells into themselves. And through genetic testing and sequencing of HIV and historic samples that they had found preserved in blood banks, they trace it back to about 1910 when it first entered the human population, and probably several times where it jumped from primates into humans. So we have to be willing to take that evidence and think about it, because initially everyone thought HIV started in the 80s. It didn't. Been around for a lot longer. So we have to think about that with COVID too. Could there have been something that existed in the human population that was similar but undetected until that point, that acquired just the right mutation that suddenly led to a pandemic?
Wow.
And spillovers happen. They have happened, and they happen all the time. Yeah, it's just like it doesn't always mean a global pandemic.
Right.
But we know that they have happened, even with raccoon dogs specifically, with this, what was the SARS?
Yeah, the other SARS viruses.
Yeah.
And there are groups of virologists out there that are constantly surveying animal populations in the wild for viruses that we have not discovered before, and trying to see if they have any properties that could affect human cells. So as humans encroach more into what we consider the wild, as our population continues to expand, spillover events are going to be more and more likely.
But that's also happening in our domesticated animals as well.
Right.
You know, like with bird flu and swine flu. You know, these are viruses which are resident in the wild population, but at the same time also in the domesticated population. Right now, they're having to do tremendous culls of chickens and turkeys across the country to try to, stop this bird flu,
right,
and epidemic throughout the country. And the worry is that there will be a mutation which will allow it to infect humans.
Right. There's anytime multiple species interact, there's always a chance eventually for spillover. And anytime you interact with another human, there's a potential chance for you to catch some sort of pathogenic agent from them. So it's sort of a compromise we make to live in society and to interact with other species, is that stuff like this will happen. And we need to do mitigating factors, right? But we can't just tie ourselves to one idea, ignore the others, and therefore leave ourselves unprepared.
The spillover concept I thought was interesting because it's not just one directional. It can spill from humans into animals as well. And I remember hearing a story about how white-tailed deer in North America are now a reservoir for COVID-19. And the theory was that white-tailed deer caught the COVID from humans. And
I could see that.
Well, there were multiple tigers in zoos that died because they caught it from humans. Same COVID as well, and house cats.
I have to say, though, it was an interesting 10 or 15 minutes as I was imagining the various scenarios by which white-tailed deer caught COVID from humans.
Well, there are people who farm white-tailed deer.
I used to wrestle white-tailed deer.
In the wild?
Oh, wait,
yes.
do tell.
That was one of my jobs, is we would catch deer.
How much did you get paid per wrestling session? I'm just kidding.
You don't want to know. It's a pittance. We would trap deer in clover traps, which were like little metal frame with just netting around it. And then we would jump in there with the deer, wrestle it to the ground, and put a sock over its face. And then it would stop struggling. I don't know why, but they just do.
And you did this why?
We would get DNA from them. And we would put a tracking collar.
Were you checking for COVID?
This was way before COVID. How young do you think I am?
Very flattering.
Very young.
Oh, my. Yeah. So I was in very close contact with deer to the point that I actually realized I had an allergy to deer hair, which how in the world would you know that otherwise?
See, now everything is just so much clearer now.
I grew up in a
makes
hunting
sense.
family, so
That
I had a
makes
lot
sense.
of exposure to
Yeah, but
deer.
the problem is those deer are not living. They didn't survive that interaction.
Sure, but the opposite could happen where I could have acquired an infection from them.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
So that's another hypothesis.
Wild deer
COVID.
wrestling.
Is wild, I don't know, raccoon dog wrestling. You don't know. There's people like me everywhere.
Option.
Now I'm going to have to think about that one. I don't know.
So the point being, we have to keep an open mind and prepare for multiple scenarios so that we can reduce the consequences of spillover events.
And it's also perfectly fine to have multiple competing hypotheses at the same time, and accepting the fact that it isn't just one, but all of them can have equal validity at the same time.
Yeah.
If anything, it'll make us better prepared in the future, because next time it probably will not happen exactly the same way.
Oh, yeah. Unlikely.
Hope not.
Yeah, gosh. I never thought I was going to live through a pandemic, and yet here we are. All right. Well, you've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White and
Alexandra Prokuda.
thank you, and we'll catch you next time.
see ya.
Bye.